Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. On the edge of a quiet Texas ranch, war brews, not with guns but with clipboards, bulls, and trespassing egos. When a ruthless HOA leader dares to cross the wrong fence, one rancher stands his ground. This isn't just a property dispute, it's a showdown of wills, and the land remembers. I have lived on this land long enough to know the sound of every fence post settling, every gate hinge sighing in the dry Texan heat, and every hoof striking the packed earth at dawn. My name is Jed Buxton, and my family has been running cattle on this ranch since before anyone thought turning desert into luxury subdivisions was a good idea. 1,200 acres of open range, certified and licensed for breeding registered longhorn bulls, professionally fenced, surveyed, insured, and inspected more times than most people check their emails. Every inch of it is mine, paid for, documented, and defended with the kind of paperwork that can make county clerks smile and lawyers sweat. The warning signs alone could scare common sense into a brick wall. Private property, no trespassing. Dangerous livestock, authorized personnel only. It is not subtle. My gates are locked, the perimeter is reinforced, and my surveillance cameras watch the horizon like tired veterans who have seen too much nonsense. That calm started to crack the day Riverside Horizon Estates crept up to my northern border like a polished parasite, a freshly manicured monument to fake perfection filled with identical homes, identical smiles, and a homeowners association that clearly mistook its clipboard for divine authority. At the head of that sparkling circus stood Karen Crosby, a woman who spoke like she swallowed a city council handbook and decided to remix it with passive aggression and scented hand sanitizer. The first letter arrived mid-morning, slipped under my gate by someone who clearly had more confidence than sense. It was decorated with a glossy logo and the words "Official Safety Initiative Notification" in dramatic bold. According to Karen, my ranch was now considered a borderline environmental and aesthetic concern due to the proximity of my bulls to their harmonized residential zone. They demanded I install visual barriers, reduce livestock exposure, and grant scheduled access to their so-called HOA safety patrol for observational inspections. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. I responded the same afternoon, calm and clear, attaching certified survey documents, property maps, and legal confirmation that my land was not now, nor had it ever been, under their jurisdiction. I explained politely that no member of any homeowners association would be stepping foot onto my ranch without a court order signed by someone who smelled less like perfume and more like authority. Karen's reply came faster than a startled steer. Her tone shifted from official to threatening with impressive speed. She spoke of community standards, border cooperation, and mutual safety responsibilities. She underlined the phrase "potentially unresolved" as if it were a prophecy. The implication was clear. If I did not fold, something ugly would crawl out of her filing cabinet. And that was the moment I knew this was not just a neighbor misunderstanding. This was a control problem wrapped in pearls and laminated policy sheets. That evening, I rode the northern fence line as the sun bled across the horizon, casting long shadows over the pasture. The bulls moved slow and heavy, unaware that someone in a perfectly pressed blazer had just declared war on their existence. From the ridge, I could see the white rooftops of Riverside glowing like a synthetic mirage, pristine and smug. I tipped my hat toward it and muttered to myself that if Karen wanted a safety initiative, she'd better start by respecting property lines, because the only standards that mattered out here were mine. The first sign that Karen had no intention of respecting my refusal wasn't another letter. It was the ground itself telling me something was wrong. I noticed it early in the morning, just after finishing my first round of feed checks. A stretch of soil near the northern fence looked torn up in a way that cattle don't manage, not even when they're in a foul mood. Tire impressions cut into the dry earth, sharp and deliberate, like a signature. I followed the tracks for several yards until they faded, but the message was clear enough. Someone had been inside my perimeter. I didn't raise my voice or start pacing. I went straight to the security room and pulled up the camera feeds. The timestamp told the story with clinical precision. Just before midnight, 4 figures moved along the fence line with the confidence of people who had no business feeling confident. Reflective vests flashed faintly under their portable lights, and even through the grainy night footage, I could read the patch across their backs. HOA Patrol. They moved like they were on official assignment. Measuring sticks, handheld tablets, camera flashes. One of them crouched near a drainage ditch and took pictures of manure runoff as if he'd discovered an emerging biohazard. Another walked right up to the outer boundary of the bull enclosure, whispering and pointing, completely unaware that the animal inside could break him in half if the mood struck. I watched them in silence, jaw tight, as they stepped over signs that clearly warned against entry and documentation. After 10 minutes, they left the way they came, calm, composed, satisfied, not a hint of urgency, not a flicker of doubt. They didn't behave like trespassers. They behaved like colonizers. I burned the footage onto a secure drive and drove straight into the county office before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. Sheriff Alvarez had known my family since before my beard turned gray, and when he saw the video, the expression on his face shifted from mild irritation to pure offense. "They crossed a private livestock perimeter at night?" he muttered, replaying the moment one of them stepped inches from the warning sign. "That's not inspection. That's stupidity wrapped in a lawsuit." He filed the report immediately and issued a formal warning to Riverside Horizon Estates, making it clear that any further unauthorized entry would be treated as criminal trespassing. The kind you don't get to excuse with a clipboard and a fake smile. Karen, of course, didn't respond with apology. She responded with propaganda. By late afternoon, my phone started buzzing. Neighbors from the outskirts sent screenshots of a post Karen had published in the Riverside community group, casting my ranch as a looming threat. She described my operation as an unregulated livestock exposure zone and claimed the HOA patrol had discovered concerning environmental markers. According to her, the community needed protection from me, as if my bulls had developed a sudden taste for suburban yoga mats. I didn't bother commenting. I forwarded the screenshots to my attorney and returned to my work. But the air had changed. The quiet confidence of the land felt tense, like the earth itself was waiting for the next move. I rode out again along the fence line as dusk settled, checking every latch, every lock, every marker. The bulls grazed in steady silence, unaware that their existence had become a talking point in some polished living room full of scented candles and nervous homeowners. Back at the ranch house, I updated every camera angle, increased motion sensitivity, and made sure the boundary alarms were armed. If Karen wanted to play Crusader, she picked the wrong territory. This land did not negotiate with entitled strangers, and I sure as hell wasn't about to let someone mistake trespassing for governance. Outside, a distant hum of construction echoed from the Riverside side, a reminder that Karen and her polished empire weren't going anywhere. And as I watched the live feed from the northern camera, waiting for another shadow to crawl across my ground, one thing was already clear. She wasn't done, and neither was I. 2 mornings after the incident, Karen decided subtlety was no longer worth the effort. I was inspecting the southern water troughs when I saw them approaching along the gravel access road, a white SUV gleaming like it had never known dust. She stepped out first, sunglasses oversized, posture straight, flanked by 2 men who looked like they'd been hired on the strength of their uniforms rather than their intelligence. Both wore pressed safety observer badges and held clipboards as if they were shields. Karen didn't bother with hesitation. She walked straight to the closed gate and knocked twice, sharp and deliberate, though she had no more right to be there than a stray dog staring at a steakhouse menu. I stepped up to the latch but didn't open it. "Mr. Buxton," she called, voice sharpened with manufactured authority. "We're here for an on-site evaluation of your border conditions. The community has concerns we can no longer ignore." "You're standing on land where your name doesn't mean a thing," I answered evenly, making no move to unlock anything. "State your legal basis to be here." She lifted a laminated folder and tapped it with her manicured nail. "Riverside Horizon Estates has launched a preventative safety inspection protocol. You will grant us temporary access, so we may assess livestock risk factors." The men nodded behind her, like backup singers who hadn't learned the song. "No," I said simply. "You do not have permission, implied or otherwise. Leave before you complicate your day." Karen's smile was thin, polished, dangerous. "Refusal will be documented. Non-cooperation reflects poorly when these matters reach administrative review." "Then document it from the public road," I replied. "That's as close as you get." One of the men tried stepping forward, testing the gate like it might magically open for confidence alone. That earned him the sharp buzz of the perimeter alarm and a slow, deliberate look from me that suggested he reconsider every decision that led him to this point. Karen raised her voice slightly, just enough to make it feel like a performance. "You're obstructing safety protocol. If you have nothing to hide, why the resistance?" I gestured behind me toward the pasture, where a few bulls shifted lazily, massive and unimpressed. "Because this isn't your protocol, and they aren't your animals. You don't get to walk into my operation like this is some petting zoo fundraiser." Her jaw tightened, irritation leaking through the professionalism. "Very well. This will be escalated." "Good luck with that," I said, turning away before she could add another rehearsed sentence. I watched from the porch as they retreated, Karen barking quiet instructions while the men snapped photos of my fence from the wrong side, the only side they were ever going to see. But the invasion didn't end with attitude and threats. That night, I discovered something else. Bright red ribbons tied crudely to several fence posts near the bull testing zone, fluttering lightly in the wind, utterly foreign to my land. Someone had been back again, not documenting, marking, provoking. The next morning, my vet, Dr. Harlan, arrived for routine assessment and stopped short when he noticed the ribbons and discarded whistle lying inches from the enclosure. He picked it up carefully and shook his head. "Whoever left this isn't just trespassing," he muttered. "They're interfering. Sound triggers like these can stress animals during evaluation. You're lucky none of the bulls reacted overnight." I already knew who was playing games. The only surprise was how stupidly bold they had become. I bagged the ribbon and whistle, filed another report with the sheriff, and increased surveillance patrols along the northern edge. If Karen wanted documentation, she was giving me more than enough. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed with yet another Riverside group alert. Karen had posted a veiled warning claiming that certain agricultural properties were refusing transparent inspection and posing increased risk to community safety. Comments poured in beneath her words, filled with dramatic theories, emojis, and nervous suburban speculation. While they typed, I stood under a wide Texas sky, watching my bulls settle into the shade, calm despite the invisible tension. The ranch remained steady, solid, grounded in reality, but the message was unmistakable. Karen wasn't inspecting, she was provoking. And this time, she was playing a game that involved living steel wrapped in muscle and instinct. The morning it happened was supposed to be routine, the kind of early shift that keeps a ranch breathing in its natural rhythm. The sun had barely started to climb when I drove past the southern barn, engine humming low, scanning the perimeter the way I always did before the bulls were put through their scheduled physical endurance observation. This wasn't some chaotic rodeo nonsense. It was a controlled veterinarian-supervised process meant to assess gait strength, stress tolerance, and responsiveness under mild environmental pressure. Everything by the book, everything calm. Until I saw movement where there should have been none. 4 figures stood inside my pasture, just past the restricted line, pretending to look professional while my ground bore their boots like insults. Rulers, tablets, clipboards. The ridiculous vests again. HOA patrols stretched across their backs like a parody of authority. One of them was crouched down, measuring distance from a marker post, like he was drafting the blueprint for stupidity. Another held his phone up, posing next to one of my bulls as if he'd discovered a rare species instead of trespassing among living muscle and instinct. I killed the engine and stepped out, the crunch of gravel loud in the silence. None of them noticed me immediately. They were too busy documenting imaginary jurisdiction. "You lost?" I called out, voice flat, controlled. They all spun around at once. Surprise flickered across their faces, replaced quickly by panic-strung defensiveness. One of them tried to recover his nerve, adjusting his vest as if it granted him power. "We're performing a community safety evaluation," he said, voice too steady for someone who had no legal leg to stand on. "We need to ensure your livestock meets proximity compliance." "You're about 2 sentences away from becoming medical paperwork," I replied. "You are inside a controlled testing zone. Get out. Now." One of them laughed nervously, the sound thin and misplaced, and that was when it happened. His boots slipped in thick mud near the runoff trench, and down he went, flailing and cursing, the sudden shout slicing sharp through the quiet air like a knife dragged across metal. It echoed. The bulls reacted instantly. 3 of them lifted their massive heads, ears flicking back, nostrils flaring, muscles tightened under thick hide. The energy in the air shifted so fast it felt like pressure before a storm. I knew that look. The men didn't. They just stood there, frozen, eyes wide, as the first bull lowered his head and charged. "Move!" I barked, but instinct had already seized them. One dropped his tablet, another bolted blindly. The one covered in mud tried to scramble up and nearly tripped again. What followed was less a retreat and more a disorganized stampede of pure terror. They ran like people who suddenly understood evolution had plans for them that did not include desk jobs. The bulls thundered across the pasture, hooves shaking the earth, roaring breaths cutting the air. One of the men veered sideways, screaming high and thin, while another threw his clipboard like it might act as a peace offering. A third tried climbing the nearest tree, hauling himself up with the desperation of someone reconsidering every life choice he'd made since breakfast. I didn't interfere. I didn't laugh either, though the image of a self-proclaimed patrol officer clinging to a branch 6 feet off the ground while pleading for mercy from a temperature-controlled suburb would have been funny on another day. Instead, I calmly opened the far gate to redirect the bull's path, guiding them back toward the appropriate enclosure route, exactly as protocol demanded. The animals slowed gradually, their focus shifting as the unfamiliar threat retreated. Within minutes, they returned to their zone, agitated but unharmed. The men, however, were anything but composed. 2 of them collapsed near the fence, gasping, covered in dust and embarrassment. One remained half-tangled in the tree branches, sobbing something about workers' compensation and divine forgiveness. When I finally approached, I stopped at a safe distance. "You have your evaluation," I said evenly. "Now leave my property before my patience expires." They didn't argue. They didn't threaten. They just stumbled toward the exit gate, limping, clutching whatever scraps of dignity they hadn't already dropped in the mud. Behind them, the pasture settled again, the bulls resuming their movement with disinterested calm, as if the entire affair had been nothing more than a strange interruption in an otherwise predictable morning. But I knew better. Karen had crossed another line, and this time she'd sent people straight into the teeth of it. By late afternoon, the entire county knew what had happened, and by evening, Karen had already reshaped the story into something unrecognizable. According to her version, my ranch had become a hostile battlefield, and her patrol had been intentionally exposed to a dangerous situation orchestrated by a negligent landowner. That was her phrase. Negligent, as if she hadn't sent 4 untrained amateurs into an active testing zone like sacrificial paperwork. The first official notice arrived the next morning by certified mail. Karen, through Riverside Horizon Estates, was filing a formal complaint, accusing me of knowingly creating a life-threatening situation, failing to restrain livestock, and violating some invented clause about civil proximity safety compliance. Thus, language was theatrical, drenched in legal perfume, the kind that tries to scare people who don't read closely. I read it once, exhaled slowly, and called my attorney. Graham Pierce specialized in agricultural and property law, the sort of man who spoke softly but dismantled arrogance with surgical precision. When he reviewed the footage from the ranch cameras, his brow lifted in something close to amusement. "They entered an active livestock area without authorization," he said calmly. "They ignored signage, breached fencing, and trespassed during scheduled animal evaluation. Not only is their claim weak, it's absurd." Absurd didn't stop Karen, it fueled her. Within 2 days, she was demanding an emergency injunction against my ranch operations, claiming the bulls posed an imminent risk to the residential zone and that I had acted with reckless intent. She framed it like I'd unleashed monsters instead. Of following standard procedures that predated her association by decades, I responded the only way I knew how. I documented everything. The vet provided a written statement confirming the scheduled activity and the sensitivity of the animals to unfamiliar noise and scent intrusion. I pulled licensing records, county approvals, livestock handling certifications, and perimeter compliance documents. Every photo, every timestamp, every warning sign I had erected stood as quiet witness to her nonsense. Graham filed a counterclaim the same day, citing unlawful entry, interference with agricultural operations, and deliberate harassment. That was the first time Karen's tone shifted, just slightly. Not apologetic, just cautious. But then she doubled down. She released another statement through the community board claiming the bulls had charged beyond containment and that she feared for the safety of families with children. Fear was her currency. She spent it recklessly, hoping emotion would override reality. But the footage didn't lie, and neither did the sheriff or the vet. By evening, Graham informed me the court had denied her emergency motion pending full review. My ranch stood untouched, but the war had officially moved into the legal arena. I stood on the porch that night, watching the horizon settle into black. The pasture calm, the bulls steady and unaware of the drama their existence had ignited. My phone chimed again with message updates from concerned neighbors on the outskirts, some supportive, some curious, all suddenly interested in boundary lines and jurisdictional limits they'd ignored for years. Karen had turned this into spectacle, but she underestimated one thing. I wasn't intimidated, I wasn't emotional, and I wasn't going to let a woman with a laminated sense of authority rewrite the rules of my land. She wanted escalation. Now she had it. The courtroom smelled like polished wood, old paper, and the kind of tension that only shows up when someone is about to be publicly humbled in a legally binding format. Karen sat at the opposite table, dressed like she was auditioning for a daytime courtroom drama, posture stiff, lips pressed thin, her eyes locked on me with a simmering mix of outrage and self-pity. Her attorney shuffled papers with forced confidence, but even from where I sat, I could see the cracks forming. Graham remained calm beside me, flipping through our documentation like a man preparing to read a restaurant bill, instead of dismantle a narrative built on ego and fiction. The judge entered without fanfare and got straight to it. Karen's side opened with emotionally charged language, painting her patrol as brave volunteers placed in mortal danger by an uncooperative and hostile landowner. She described panic, terror, alleged chaos, and dramatic phrases that sounded written for applause instead of legal evaluation. Then the video played. Silence rolled across the courtroom as the screen filled with footage of her patrol stumbling through my pasture like misplaced mannequins. The moment the man slipped and screamed, a few quiet snorts of laughter broke through the benches. When the bulls began their charge and one man attempted to scale a tree like a panicked squirrel in khakis, the judge's eyebrow twitched upward, the closest thing to public amusement I had seen from him. Karen stiffened. Graham stood next. No theatrics, just facts. He walked the judge through the timeline. Unauthorized entry, marked warning signs, controlled testing zone, veterinary documentation. He highlighted Karen's own statements where she admitted ordering the inspection without consent and without county authorization. The contradiction hung in the air like smoke after a struck match. The veterinarian was called to testify. Calm, clinical, precise. He explained how sudden noise and human interference directly affects bull behavior during evaluation, potentially endangering both humans and animals. His conclusion was simple and devastating. The situation had been fully avoidable if basic protocol and property rights had been respected. Karen's attorney attempted to redirect blame, implying that I could have restrained the animals more effectively or anticipated emotional responses from the livestock. That earned him a look from the judge that suggested reality might be worth acknowledging. Court recessed briefly, but the tension never left. I didn't look at Karen. I didn't need to. Her reputation was bleeding faster than her argument. When proceedings resumed, the judge requested clarification on one detail: the supposed authorization that Karen claimed her patrol operated under. Her attorney fumbled. Pages turned. Silence filled the room. No formal approval, he admitted quietly. The judge nodded once. That small movement said everything. Outside, the sky had shifted into overcast gray as I stepped down the courthouse stairs, Graham matching my pace. The legal firestorm wasn't finished yet, but the balance had shifted. Karen's authority no longer sounded convincing in a room built for truth. She watched from the doorway as I walked away, her expression tight, calculating, already planning whatever desperate move would follow. The storm hadn't passed, but it was rolling in her direction now. The ruling did not come with theatrics, no dramatic slam of a gavel or grand speech for the cameras Karen had quietly hoped would appear. The judge's voice was controlled, deliberate, almost bored by the performance that had been forced into his courtroom. Riverside Horizon Estates was found responsible for unauthorized entry, reckless interference with agricultural operations, and intentional harassment of a private landowner operating within lawful standards. Karen's proud posture fractured in visible stages as each word landed, her confidence draining like air escaping a poorly sealed tire. The compensation figure was read slowly, clearly, with mathematical indifference. $280,000 in damages, fees, and penalties payable by the association she so eagerly weaponized. A formal order followed, instructing the immediate suspension of her executive authority pending internal review by the HOA's governing board. Karen did not look at anyone. Not the judge, not her attorney, certainly not me. Outside, the courthouse steps felt unusually quiet for what had just unfolded. Reporters gathered in hesitant clusters, murmuring like they smelled blood, but weren't sure who was bleeding. A few attempted to corner Karen as she exited, microphones thrust forward with questions masked as concern. She brushed past them without a word, heels striking concrete in sharp protest against reality. My phone buzzed before I even reached my truck. Messages, dozens of them. Residents who bordered my land, ranchers from neighboring counties, even two former members of Riverside Horizon Estates, expressing relief that someone had finally drawn a line against her conduct. The contrast was almost surreal, as if her authority had collapsed overnight, and everyone suddenly remembered breathing came without permission slips. Later that evening, the HOA sent out an emergency notice announcing a special assembly to address leadership irregularities. By the next afternoon, videos from their community forum were circulating through local channels. Karen stood rigid behind a folding podium, attempting to defend her decisions, but the room was no longer receptive. Voices rose, accusations followed, and she dissolved into defensive rhetoric that sounded more like desperation than leadership. A vote was called. It did not go in her favor. By unanimous decision, Karen was removed from her post effective immediately, and the board approved the initiation of a full procedural audit into her past actions. She left the building through a side entrance under a low sky that mirrored her drained expression. No applause, no pride, only the hollow aftermath of unchecked control finally hitting ground. Back at the ranch, the bulls fed calmly. The gates stayed closed. The land remained unmoved by politics, untouched by apologies, unbothered by clipboard crusaders. I stood near the main fence line and watched the sun dip behind my western ridge, the silence familiar and steady. Karen's echo in my life faded into legal residue and distant rumor, and the ranch returned to breathing again. The ranch woke long before the sun dared to stretch its hand over the horizon, the land breathing in the cool morning air with the patience of something that had outlived arrogance, laws, and temporary power plays. The earth felt solid beneath my boots, still damp from the night, holding the scent of grass, dust, and animal warmth. The bulls moved with their usual quiet gravity across the pasture, their heavy forms casting elongated shadows that slid slowly over the terrain as the first thin line of amber light crept into the sky. There were no patrol vests cutting through the field, no artificial beams skating across the ground, no anxious voices pretending authority, no one pointing, measuring, or inventing problems where none lived. Just soil, muscle, breath, and the kind of silence you only earn after weathering a storm that wasn't born of nature. Karen's removal became old news in record time, whispered over fences, repeated at grocery counters, and passed from truck window to truck window on back roads like a story people enjoyed because it finally ended the right way. By noon, a local reporter rolled up my drive without bothering to announce herself, her camera crew tumbling out behind her like confused birds who had mistaken my ranch for a stage. She asked for commentary, for a reaction, for that neat little soundbite they package between weather and commercials. She called me the man who stood his ground, and I corrected her with the only truth I cared to speak. I hadn't stood anything. I had simply stayed where I'd always been while others tried to pretend it wasn't mine. Her camera lingered on the fences, on the herd, on the open stretch of land that had outlasted every polished ego that tried to frame it as negotiable. I watched them leave the same way they arrived, dust curling up behind their tires, and the land didn't change in the slightest for their presence or absence. That evening, an envelope arrived bearing the new HOA board's official seal. Inside was something Karen would have choked on before daring to write it, a direct acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a formal apology, a written assurance that my property would no longer be referenced, discussed, or approached in any capacity beyond what the law permitted. There was no flowery language, no sugarcoating, no hint of bravado, just accountability. I read it once, then placed it with the rest of the documentation, not as a gesture of forgiveness, but as evidence that even the loudest mistakes eventually find their quiet conclusion. The following week, I supervised the installation of reinforced steel gates along the northern perimeter. The posts were sunk deep, welded with intention, built less as a reaction and more as a reminder that lines exist for a reason. I upgraded the monitoring feed to link directly with the sheriff's office, ensuring any future act of entitlement would not go unseen. Not because fear had taken root, but because experience had proved that ignorance tends to wander, and I preferred it wander unsuccessfully. Karen herself drifted into rural folklore faster than most storms disappear from the horizon. People spoke her name with half a laugh, half a warning. Someone claimed she placed her house on the market overnight and vanished before anyone could question her. Vermont surfaced as the most common guess. Far enough for a fresh start, cold enough to match the air she carried into every room she ever dominated. In time, the ranch found its natural rhythm again. That steady pulse only the land remembers when human nonsense grows tired and slinks away. The vet resumed his familiar schedule. The bulls returned to their calm patterns, uninterested in the past drama that had swirled around their hooves. The fences stood quiet and firm, not just as barriers, but as unspoken agreement between land and those who respected it. One late afternoon, when the sun spilled gold across the grass and the sky softened into copper hues, I watched the largest bull move past me with deliberate ease, his presence both towering and strangely peaceful. He carried himself with the assurance of something that had never asked permission to exist and never would. I named him Sentinel, not because he charged recklessly or fought for dominance, but because he didn't need to. He simply held space with undeniable authority. The wind whispered low over the pasture, carrying dust, warmth, and the soft sound of hooves brushing earth. No echoes of shouting, no trembling voices begging for control, only quiet strength and continuity. And standing there, with the horizon stretched endless before me, I understood a truth deeper than any verdict or legal phrasing could ever capture. This land does not justify itself. It does not defend its worth. It belongs because it exists, and it holds its ground without apology.